Because, hey, let's face it, a world without religion doesn't have a prayer. With so many of the world's problems caused by religion, what better solution could there possibly be than to promote yet more of it? Yours, in a very real sense, sincerely. Well, that's the end of the document that... I now want to turn to part 2. By the way, the part that I think might be really important is part 4, and I hope I get time to get to it, which is, I thought it might be helpful to have an extended question and answer session on evolution and creationism and how to deal with creationists, because this may be something that many of you need to do. Maybe you need to have arguments with creationists rather often, and you may have questions about evolution that I might be able to help to answer. So I hope to get to part 4. Part 2 is quote mining. I'm going to begin with an example, quite a well-known one, from Charles Darwin. Darwin, faced with the complexity of the eye, said, "To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree." Well, that famous quotation was always going to be a prime candidate for quote mining, omitting, of course, the words that immediately follow it. Yet reason tells me. I think you know it. And you can read it anyway. Using Yahoo's search engine, I have just searched the World Wide Web for "I freely confess absurd in the highest degree" and obtained 2,890 hits. For comparison, I then searched for "if numerous gradations from a perfect and complex eye," which is from the following passage, and obtained only 1,550 hits. The former phrase has been quoted nearly twice as often as the latter. Let's call this a mining index of 2. It's actually quite a modest mining index. The Cambrian explosion, as you probably know, is an event in the history of life, in the fossil history, in which it appears that about 500 million years ago, a little bit more, most of the great animal phyla rather suddenly appear in the fossil record. Needless to say, creationists love it because it looks to them as though there was nothing before that. These phyla just suddenly sprang into existence. In The Blind Watchmaker, I was young and foolish in those days and not aware of the potential for quote mining. I wrote that the majority of animal phyla, we find them, quote, already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. I went on to say, needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. Well, I was savvy enough, evidently, to realize that creationists would love it, but not, in 1986, savvy enough to know that they would gleefully quote my lines back at me in their own favor, carefully admitting what followed, which was a rather lengthy explanation of the Cambrian explosion and about how, in fact, it must have been preceded by a very long period of evolutionary history. I went on to say, evolutionists of all stripes believe, however, that this really does represent a very large gap in the fossil record. Well, I did my quote mining index calculation on this as well. I took the phrase, "it is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history." I subjected that phrase to Yahoo's search engine and got 1,250 hits. I then looked at the next bit, Evolutionists of all stripes believe, however, that this really does represent a very large gap in the fossil record, and got 63 hits. This gives a mining index, 1250 divided by 63, of nearly 20, 19.8. I want now to introduce a special kind of quote mining, which I think you'll recognize when you see it. I call it mining the Eddington concession. Sir Arthur Eddington was a famous British astronomer and also popularizer of science. I've used this quotation often for other purposes. I'm going to read it one more time. Eddington was trying to emphasize the unique, almost, importance of the second law of thermodynamics, and he chose to do it in this way. If someone points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. If it is found to be contradicted by observation, well, these experimentalists do bungle things sometimes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can offer you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. Notice the rhetorical device that Eddington is using here. Clearly, he wasn't seriously intending to cast doubts on Maxwell's equations, nor on the competence of experimental physicists. Precisely the opposite. Eddington's manifest respect for Maxwell's theorizing and for experimental physicists was designed to highlight his final extolling of the unbudgeable veracity of the second law of thermodynamics. That rhetorical device is what I am naming the Eddington concession. If a journalist, say, reading the Eddington quotation, announced to the world that Sir Arthur Eddington is skeptical of Maxwell's equations, or Sir Arthur Eddington thinks experimental physicists are all bunglers, that would be mining the Eddington concession. Under the auspices of an American religious foundation in October 2008, I had a public debate in Oxford with a Christian apologist, an Irish mathematician called John Lennox. A couple of days later, the same John Lennox went up to Scotland, to Inverness, where he spoke to a large audience, and he quoted the recent Oxford debate with me.
But finally, and this is the grand irony, I was stunned last Tuesday night, completely stunned, by this. Richard Dawkins started off by saying that he'd no difficulty with the concept of Einstein's God. Now, he says this in his book. Einstein's God, that is, in some sense, the laws of nature or something like this, which is interesting because it shows that he senses there's a need for an explanation of the beginnings of things. We asked him directly, how did it all begin? He doesn't know. So it's a matter of faith, whether it's blind or not, you must judge, for him, that there's a purely naturalistic explanation of it. But the very fact that he would talk about Einstein's God, even in his book, fascinated me. But now came the stunning revelation. And I missed it in one sense, and when the lecture was over, I realized what he'd said. He said a good case could be made for the deistic God. Well, that's staggering. Because that's exactly what happened to Antony Flew not long ago. Antony Flew is a philosopher who used to have Dawkins' place in the world as the world's most famous atheist, a world expert on the philosophy of David Hume, who comes from Scotland, as all of you know. And Antony Flew, at a high age, has become convinced of deism. That is, there is a God who started it all off. And what convinced him? DNA. And its complexity. The nature of its complexity. Not just that it's complex. This glass of water is complex, ladies and gentlemen. It's the semiotic nature of the complexity. And yet here is Richard Dawkins last Tuesday saying a good case can be made for a deistic God. But look what that does with his argument. From simple to complex. Deism says there must have been a God in the beginning to start it off because it's too complex. I don't know where the argument is going to go next, but I was utterly fascinated at this apparently new concession. Anthony Flew has moved a very long way. If Dawkins now believes that a good case can be made for deism, then it seems to me that knocks the heart out of his argument about complexity here. But we're not finished yet.